Hello. Hi, Dave. How are you?
Hi, Jeremy. Good. How are you?
Good, good. So we're here today with Dr. Dave Weed of Warren, Rhode Island, who has been gracious enough to answer some of the questions that I think that will help. His answers will help students in decolonizing the land really understand the history, the sort of political history, the culture, et cetera, of Sowams, but specifically also the Sowams heritage area that Dr. Weed has been working on to get established for the past several years. Really interesting, really neat project that involves collaborations with the Pokanoket Nation and beyond, with towns, the state, the entire region, Rhode Island and Massachusetts. So Dave, thank you so much for being with us. And if you could just start off by telling us a little bit about yourself, how you got interested in Indigenous history and colonial history, and then also maybe a little bit about the Sowams heritage area too.
Sure, I'd be happy to, Jeremy. I guess I should start at the beginning, which was just a couple years ago, May of 2017, when members of the Mashpee tribe down in the Cape began getting in touch with me as a neighbor to Burrs Hill Park, which is right behind my house in Warren, across from the town beach. It's a park that I knew had some history, but I didn't know a whole lot about that history. I had been interested in some of the sites in the area having to do with the King Philip War, and put together a small website maybe 10, 15 years ago about that. But that was pretty much the extent of my knowledge and understanding about what occurred here for the past 12,000 years. However, when the tribe showed up and asked me to distribute some invitations to people in the neighborhood to a ceremony that was going to take place on May 17th, I got really curious. Turns out that they had been collecting burial items that had been taken from that park over the last 100 years and were stored at various museums. A little museum we have here in town over the town library, Heffenreffer, the Hay Museum in New York, and I think some at Harvard. Wow. So they spent quite a number of years pulling all that together, and then I believe around 2007 got permission from the town to return those items that had been taken from native grave sites in what is now the park. And the town not only agreed to that, but also I think gave them a $15,000 grant to provide for the work that had to be done. So I joined this ceremony over in the park with several hundred members of the tribes from all over the area who were invited to this sacred ceremony, which for them was an opportunity to return their ancestors' remains to the place that they had been placed. Probably our best understanding is somewhere in the mid 1500s till not long after the Massasoit Osamequin, his death. He didn't die here. He died, I understand, near Brookline, but his body was carried here and buried here. And we have a pretty good understanding that that was his grave because Virginia Baker, a local historian around the turn of the 20th century, described items that had been removed from one of the graves that included the lace from a red horseman's coat and a copper chain necklace, which they recovered from the grave. We know by the written accounts of the English that they had given those items to the Massasoit when we first met them in 1621. So there's every reason to believe that not only were those items his, but also they were buried with him. It would make no sense for them to be buried with someone else.
Right.
So
So
99% sure this is where the Massasoit was buried.
Wow. So able to
The
triangulate.
rest of the story is
Yeah.
when the Providence and Bristol Railroad Company began to build railroad tracks from Providence to Bristol, they came right through the eastern edge of the park. You can now travel on that because it's the East Bay Bike Path. In
Right.
the process of building the railroad, they began removing sand and gravel from this area that was known then as Burrs Hills, plural, because it was a series of sandy mounds between the railroad tracks and the Warren River. So, in order to fill in areas of the track further south of here, we know that they excavated more and more of those sand hills, only to find from time to time skeletons and burial items. And they had no idea what they were, whose they were. These were unmarked graves. They were certain that they weren't English graves, but some thought they were African American graves. Others thought they were Native American graves. It
Right.
wasn't until 1913 when Charles Carr, the town librarian, who was an amateur archaeologist, decided to get permission from the railroad, which he did, to excavate any remaining graves, and spent the summer of 1913 digging up the northern end of the park and removed items from 42 grave sites. That's all documented in a book written by Susan Gibson, and that's noted as one of the best archaeological sites for this period anywhere in New England.
Wow.
For archaeologists, this was a real find. For the native people, it meant that their ancestors' graves were disturbed, removed, put on display, and I ask people all the time, how would you feel if your grandparents, let's say, had their grave dug up without your permission and had their bones and the things buried with them on display for the public? I don't think anyone would feel good about that. Well, the tribe certainly didn't, and they went to great lengths to get those items back from the various museums where they had been distributed in the early 20th century. When they were successful at that, got the town to come and dig a hole at pretty much in the same area where Carr was digging. Uh, they put in a 10 by 10 foot concrete vault, and then in a sacred ceremony, which certainly I was not able to attend, but many of the tribe people did, those items were returned to the earth in the same location where they had been removed.
Wow.
So that was an extraordinary event and certainly got my attention. Um, as it turns out, I had just retired as a clinical psychologist after 43 years and decided that this should be my next chapter in my life, is to find out more about what was going on there. About a year or so before that event, a woman named Helen Trader uh, from Barrington had given a talk about the Sowams Heritage Area. And that video is available. If your students go online and look at videos, they'll find a link to that. It's just a 4-minute, beautifully done video in which Helen introduces the idea of creating a heritage area. There are 53 heritage areas around the country. Probably the best known one in this area is the Blackstone Valley Heritage Area. They're federally authorized, but they really bring together a number of local locations, history, in museums in some cases, so that people can discover a whole series of things in one area. Her idea was to create a heritage area based on Sowams. Sowams is the name of the southern area, which was the home of the Massasoit Osamequin. We don't know exactly where his settlements were. We presume there were a number of them. Um, the local lore says that there was a settlement at a spring, which was located at the end of Baker Street in the older section of Warren. We don't have any archaeological evidence of that, but it's well presumed that the Massasoit spent much of his time, particularly during the time of the Pilgrims' arrival, because we also know from the English record that Edward Winslow, who was essentially acting as the Secretary of State, if you will, for the Pilgrims, decided after striking a treaty with the tribe at Plymouth in March of 1621 that he would come and visit and see the Massasoit at his home. Some of that had to do with the military concerns about getting an idea of how many people were here and what their military preparedness might be and things of that sort. But it turned out to be the beginning of this 25-year-long friendship between Ed Winslow and the Massasoit. And that's well documented, partly because Winslow had been a printer in England, and he published 2 books, or he did the first one with Bradford in 1622, and then another one, Good News from England, in 1624, in which there are very detailed accounts of 2 visits. The first one I just described, and then the second one in 1623, when Winslow had that the Massasoit was gravely ill and came here. It takes 2 days to get here on foot from Plymouth, but arrived in time. Students can read the whole story in detail, but basically helped to cure him, and that cemented their friendship for the rest of their lives. Winslow was only here until about 1646, and then his son Josiah took over, and we all know that the Massasoit passed away sometime in 1661, and first his son, his oldest son, Wamsuta, and then his younger son, Metacom, took over. So that's, briefly the history of what took place right here in Warren,
right,
400 years ago,
right,
which is a history that not many people know. Certainly the people from the Pokanoket tribe who still live in this area are familiar with, mostly, however, from the English record, because they lost so much of their history during the Great Dying, a period of time between 1616 and 1619, not only in Plymouth, but all along the Massachusetts coast there, where up to 90% of the population died of one or more infectious diseases brought, we're certain, by the various settlers who came into the area, traders and fishermen and one thing or another. That meant that the tribe lost a lot of their history because the elders passed away during that time. Then at the end of the King Philip War, they also lost 2/3 of their tribe members in the war, losing even more of their oral history, so that the scattered numbers who were left after that war did not have access to the kind of information that would have given us a much more robust history of the tribe prior to that time. So that's the broad outline of the Sowams Heritage Area, why it's important. But this project is really to bring the public to greater awareness of all of these things. I figured as long as I was learning this, why not share it with everybody? And I was relatively well skilled in both video work and photography and websites, that creating a website was the natural thing to do. And anybody can go on heritagearea.org and see well over 100 pages now of different aspects. What I was looking for was not just the native history, because there's not a lot of evidence of that, but also the English history in this area, the settler history, and the various places that grew up around here quite rapidly, starting in the late 1620s, and settlements, including probably the first one was in Rehoboth, what's now East Providence, right around the Newman Church. Reverend Newman brought a whole group down from Weymouth at the time and settled that area, having secured permission from the Massasoit and from Plymouth. So that was the first time that English people moved into this area in any numbers. But those numbers gradually increased over time. More and more land was sold until the years prior to the outbreak of the King Philip War, 1670. Of the tribe, whose numbers had been diminishing all this time, again due to more outbreaks of illness and just the stress of colonization, that they were down to what's estimated about 700, all remaining what is today the Bristol Peninsula, just south of Warren, where Roger Williams University is. That was an area that was reserved for the tribe and remained so until after the war, in which the land was then given by the king to 4 proprietors who divided it and used the money to pay off war debts. So that's the brief history of how Bristol got involved. And students might want to look around at some of the early history in Bristol. I'm certain that all of them have driven right by the oldest house in Bristol. That's right on Hope Street, just north of the bridge where they're working right now.
Right.
Little gray house, and you can find a description by going to the house, first period houses section on the website, and then looking at a description of that. But that was the first house built in Bristol, and it's still standing today.
Right. So, so Dave, thank you. That was magnificent. And just to kind of refocus and reframe, the idea of a heritage area is, as you said, it's a federal designation, or a federal. The federal government acknowledges the creation of a heritage area, and then it blends together some properties that may be in the federal government's possession, some that may be in the state's possession, towns, private collections, you name it. Right. But they're held together by a theme, and so the theme of the Sowams Heritage Area would be, or is proposed to be, early colonial history in southern New England, or specifically around Narragansett Bay, right?
Correct.
How extensive is Sowams? And furthermore, why Sowams? Because Sowams, of course, is a native place name, and so I think it's really interesting to consider that is right there in the headline of the heritage area. And so, if you could kind of describe the parameters of the project, maybe where the project is in terms of realization, and then also reflect on kind of the importance of Sowams as the name.
Well, we chose that name because it was the ancestral name of the Massasoit's homeland. And from all the descriptions we've been able to find historically, it included not only Bristol, Warren, and Barrington, but also up through East Providence, Seekonk, Rehoboth, and Providence. And a lot of people do not understand that because Roger Williams was purchased Providence after crossing the Seekonk River in 1636, everyone assumes that that wasn't Pokanoket land, when in fact it had been for many years, and had only recently been acquired, if you will, by the Narragansett tribe, because they sensed that the Pokanokets were in a weakened state due to the infectious diseases. So they moved into that area. We're not exactly sure, but sometime between 1616 and 1619. So it was easy for them to give it to Roger because it wasn't their ancestral land.
Fascinating.
But that's why we we include Providence and certainly the story of Roger Williams, which is really important to this whole thing. There's so many layers of this story, and what the heritage area is really going for is looking at the transition of time from native occupation, ownership, if you will, of the land to settler occupation and ownership of the land, which occurred in a relatively short period of time, basically between 1620 and 1680, that transition took place. But it's a key transition to, and explains the history of colonial settlement from there on in, all the way to the West Coast.
Right.
How Native people were regarded, how land was acquired, the explosion of the English and settler population, and the
Right.
diminution of the Native populations. So it's kind of a microcosm right here for what happened everywhere in this country. So calling it Sowams Heritage Area takes into account that early history, brings in information and locations. There are about, we've identified over 50 locations in this area that have some connection to the 17th century. So people can go there and explore them. If you will, it creates a trail where people could go from one to the other. We're also in the process of installing some historic markers. I just had two arrive last night, one for Burrs Hill Park and one for the First Congregational Church in Bristol, which was a historic place. Couldn't have a town without a church, couldn't have a church without a pastor, couldn't have a pastor without a parsonage, and that's the parsonage that was built there on Hope Street. So people could learn about how this area developed, how settlement took place, but also the story of what this displacement of people who had lived here successfully for 12,000 years in the course of 40 years lost everything.
Right.
So this is, when you talk about this history, it's one thing to see this as the first of English settlement and the start of a new colony and all of that. That's what people have gotten excited about for the last 100 years. When in fact, when you look at it from a Native perspective, this is a period of mourning, and this is not a good event that happened. They saw the dissolution of their culture altogether and the loss of history. So it's essentially an acknowledgement, an understanding of what happened that the Sowams Heritage Area needs to interpret to people, so that people don't have kind of happy-go-lucky ideas about how the Pilgrims came and everything was wonderful, and oh yes, the Indians helped them. Well, they did, and the English wouldn't have survived without the help of the Pokanoket tribe here. But roughly in the 1640s, things began to go south in the relationship. And after Winslow was no longer here, his son Josiah was then dealing with Wamsutta and Philip. Things really got bad. Also, the Mass Bay Colony was much more in charge than Plymouth at that time. And they didn't have any original agreement. They weren't trying to live up to this ideal that had been established. So you could certainly understand why it led to ultimately to a conflict, and one that was devastating on both sides.
Well, so again, this is really fascinating. I want to dive a little bit more into the relationship that you have personally and that the Sowams Heritage Area has with the Pokanoket tribe. But maybe before we do that, and as a way to maybe get to an answer on that, I want to return to what something that you seem to just be suggesting with how the Heritage Area can frame a more realistic, a more comprehensive view of this, you know, first contact and first exposure of very different worlds, and the ascent of one world, and the sort of lapse of another world into a state of mourning. It doesn't disappear either, right? It isn't a matter. I think sometimes settlers can get a notion that, okay, it was a shame what happened, but it's done and all the Indians are dead. That sort of half-baked notion. So it seems that what you're going for with the Sowams Heritage Area is a kind of recognition, acknowledgement, and maybe even a kind of responsibility to get the facts straight. And so I'm wondering what if there is a kind of message about what settlers who live, or just people, right? I mean, we can dispense with that language for a second. People who live or people who visit New England, visit Rhode Island, that there's a responsibility that they know the fulsome picture of colonial history and the history that connects between the 17th century up to the 21st. And that's where I think if people are visiting a colonial heritage area, their preconceived notions about colonial history maybe aren't challenged. But when they're learning about colonial history in Sowams, which is the native land, and by the way, there are 21st century Pokanoket people who are part of this project, that tells a very different story, and it invites everyone to be responsible for the history that we all share.
Well, as the Sagamore of the tribe, Bill Guy says, this is about undoing the lies. When you think about and go through the history of Plymouth, it was all sanitized. There was no notion until 1970 that Native people had objection to what had gone on there. Now there's a National Day of Mourning and Thanksgiving, and some backing into that recognition there. We want to start with that recognition. We don't want to tell this fairy tale and then have to backtrack. We want to start with the reality of what happened there, both the positive and the negative, and help people learn a more accurate telling of the story. I think that should go a long way toward helping people to understand that the tribe is very much alive and well and still here, and in a lot of ways never really left, but that recognizing the values of the tribe is just as important. And this is where this project dovetails nicely into environmental concerns. Part of this is to recognize the areas that still exist that are substantially unchanged from the last 400 years. And we work with the land trusts here. We're trying to help people who look at the environmental issues in Eastern Rhode Island, East Bay, Rhode Island, and Southeastern Massachusetts, but also appreciate the history of where that land came from and who had occupied it.
Yeah.
So it's a nice way to, we bring the historians together, we bring the tourists together, we bring the land trust people together, the environmentalists together. It all gets bundled together in one story. So yeah. That's kind of where we're going with this.
And how does the contemporary Pokanoket Nation fit into either the work that Sowams Heritage Area is doing, has done, plans to do, but also I know that you're active with a group of citizen activists who call themselves Friends of the Pokanoket, which fits into this story somehow too. So maybe you can tell us a bit about that.
Well, before I started this project, I had no idea that there were members of the Pokanoket tribe living within a few miles of here. Gradually, I got introduced to them, began to get to know them, and learned their whole perspective on this, and said from the beginning that I'm not moving ahead with any of this until you're comfortable with it. And that's been the case all along. I regularly meet with them. I often send them the web pages and say, please look this over. If there's anything that needs to be changed, please let me know. And they do. And I learn a lot as I go in this whole process. because I see this as their one good opportunity, not their only opportunity, but one good opportunity for them to tell their story from their perspective. And I'm trying to be as true to that as possible. Um, I talk about English history because that's what people are interested in. That's how I get my audience, if you will. But once I grab them, then I tell them about the parts of the story they don't know anything about. And that's where we introduce the tribe. I was able just last year to get a grant from the Rhode Island Council on the Humanities, which paid for the tribe to go to schools and libraries and share their culture with people in this whole series of educational events. They're all online on the website. People can see them, but it had been some time since the tribe had been out. They used to do this quite a bit,
Right.
but as many of the tribe members are getting older, it was more difficult. This is also a tribe, people associate tribes with big money and big casinos and all that kind of stuff. This tribe has not only no casino, but no interest in having a casino. And really, these are people who do not have any means of wealth. They don't own any tribal land. So they're really working with the most minimal of resources. So anything I can try to help them tell their story is all to the good. They've been terrific. It's been a wonderful relationship. I've gotten involved with a number of projects of their own. There's a one project to bring to light the history of the tribes in the Providence area who are not Narragansett, and develop a tribal commission to make information about that more public. So as we move along, they are an integral part of this whole effort.
Mhm. Fantastic. And the Friends of the Pokanoket group, is that a more focused sort of
That's much more focused, and
committee? Yeah.
I can't tell the whole story in detail, but basically there's been an effort on the part of the tribe over the last 20 years or more to get access to their tribal ancestral land at Mount Hope, which is the area owned by Brown University. They have access to it by permission, and they're able to go up to the Massasoit seat there and use property for their tribal ceremonies. But that's by permission. What they're looking for is ownership, if you will. They should have access to that land anytime they wish. And the university has had difficulty with negotiating that, figuring out what to do. It's taken much too long in the process, but we are pleased that there at least some movement in that. But we felt that in order to get a little more movement, we would start a friends group of local citizens, people of interest, such as yourself, and use whatever educational tools we can muster within that group to help tell the story, so that it's not just this little tribe. Okay, they're not, we're not. They're about 300 members of the tribe, but their council is about a dozen people. So this is not a big corporate effort on their part.
Right.
Against Brown University with billions in endowment and all the lawyers you can ask for. So it's not a fair fight, okay? And what we're trying to do with the Friends group is to even the score a little bit and let the university know that it's not just the tribe who has an interest in this. Lots of people have an interest in their having their ancestral land under their own control. So we'll see how it goes. But certainly
Great.
any efforts the students can help with an educational program is all to the good. Things anybody can do, we'll be making efforts in the future and announcing things that people can do to support this.
Great,
So
great.
that's the brief story.
Awesome. Well, that's exactly what our students are queuing up to do next. As we get into April and early May, we're going to be reading and watching and digesting all the information that we can about the Pokanoket, about this colonial contact, all the information you've shared here today, but also via the Sowams heritagearea.org website will be fantastic in coming up with visually and textually interesting ways to distribute the story and to get the story of the Pokanoket, who I think the Sagamore has said that they feel like they're an invisible tribe, right? Because they're certainly here. They're not a huge tribe, but 300 is nothing to sneeze at, and they have long-lasting documented ties to this area, and yet there's very little recognition, very little acknowledgement. And as you say, we're going up against a well-resourced and perhaps well-meaning adversary like Brown University. It takes every bit you can do to kind of even those scales a little bit. So that's what the students are excited to get into next. Before we sign off, though, Dave, I wonder if you would take a crack at just a kind of a global question, a kind of summation question, which is reflecting on your own history with these issues and how you became interested in them. Would you give advice to non-Indigenous people, be they in the area of Sowams, in East Bay, Rhode Island, or more generally, about how they can come into more respectful and constructive relations with Native peoples in this country?
Sure. Well, the first thing is to get yourself educated. And there's no excuse now, especially during the pandemic. Get yourself good books. Most people start with Philbrick's Mayflower, which is a pretty good rendering of the story. But there are dozens of others, and maybe I can send you a bibliography if people really want to dive into it. You probably
Great.
one of your own. But I think the first thing is for people to learn the basics of the history of what took place here from an accurate, historically accurate perspective. I think that helps a lot in terms of understanding then what the tribe's perspective is. There are occasions from time to time when the tribe does presentations, and unfortunately right now we're not going to be able to do those, but we had hoped to have a whole park, Burrs Hill Park, filled with visitors when the tribe would be there to talk about their culture. That looks like that's not going to happen on the 5th of July unless there's some miracle ahead that we don't know about with this pandemic. But we have the funding for that, and whether we have to put it off for another year, we'll have to see. But if people learn about those kinds of opportunities, they hear that the tribe is coming and they want to meet people. Another really good opportunity is something called the Big Drum Powwow that's held at the Roger Williams Memorial. This is a little park on North Main Street in Providence, usually on a Saturday and Sunday in September. And it's wide open. Anybody can come there. And not only can you talk to Native people, but you can participate in their dances and the drumming and look at some of the items that they have for sale there and things of that sort. So it's a chance for people outside the tribe to be invited in to learn about the culture. And I highly recommend that. And if you see any other powwows in the area, the Seekonk sometimes do one, and it's not, if you look around, it's not all that hard to find one of those events. And I recommend that people get to know some of these folks. I mean, good grief, they were here long before any colonists were, so they deserve the opportunity to be named and greeted.
Indeed. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dave. This was a pleasure, and we'll be following up with our labors. We'd love to get your expert eye and your seasoned opinion on kind of how we can best take our efforts to advocate on behalf of the Pokanoket forward. We hope that you stay safe and healthy, and we'll be talking to you soon.
Thanks a lot. Same to you, Jeremy.
All right.